Rain slashed sideways across the New Jersey coast on April 3, 1933, the wind rising in hard pulses that lifted the ocean into white rips. Near Lakehurst, ground crews and slickers steadied the gray giant at its mast, while floodlights turned raindrops into sparks. The rigid airship USS Akron, 785 feet of aluminum girders and helium cells, eased free at 7:28 p.m. Her belly lamps flicked on, then vanished into cloud as she climbed. In the control car, Commander Frank C. McCord watched the altimeter climb and kept his voice flat, his hands light. He had a cabinet full of weather reports that all said the same thing: rough air, coastal squalls, visibility poor. The orders were routine: night navigation work and radio beacon calibration along the New England shore, but nothing about the night felt routine. The Atlantic looked close enough to touch. They tracked northeast in fog so thick the signal lamps could barely find the nose. Drizzle worked into every seam. In the radio room, Chief Radioman Robert Copeland logged bearings and times. In the hangar bay, men checked the trapeze hook used for recovering Sparrowhawk fighters, though none were aboard for this trip. A red two-star flag fluttered below the control car, the mark of Rear Admiral William Moffett, the Navy's architect of aviation, aboard as an observer with two other senior officers and a civilian guest. Officers traded tight nods when he walked through. He was the man who had kept big airships alive in the budget fights. If the fleet had a future, it was partly because he believed. Past Barnegat Light, just after 10, the wind sharpened. The Akron rode heavy in the nose, rain hammering the envelope hard enough to drum in the control car. The engineers trimmed her with water ballast and moved crew to adjust the center of gravity. McCord kept her at a few hundred feet to avoid the worst glare and static above. The night outside had no horizon, just a smear of lightning to the east and the long, dark heave of the sea. When the first brutal downdraft hit, the deck tilted with a slow, sickening certainty. Men grabbed whatever was bolted down. McCord ordered more ballast dumped. Valves hissed. Gauges answered sluggishly. A second hit came like a shove in the back. The bow dropped. There was no fire. No bright catastrophe. Just rain, wind, and a machine larger than a battleship pushed down by a storm front that had been building all day. In the control car, someone shouted, "Hold her!" And then the ocean surface was close enough to mark the wave crests. A wall of spray smashed against the windows. The keel structure groaned. When the tail struck water, the shock shuddered through the ship. The Akron yawed, nose pitching up for a breath of lift, then slammed down again. Men tumbled, lights went out, and the world became cold salt and blackness. The sea finished what the storm started. The airship broke as water rushed into the control car and compartments along the keel. Helium kept pieces buoyant, but they were slick, rounded, and impossible to mount in heavy seas. There were life rings on hooks and a single life raft somewhere in the darkness, but no life jackets. Standard issue had never reached the crew. Men surfaced and shouted to one another by name, their voices clipped short by spray and wind. Oilskins, boots, and wet wool pulled at their shoulders and legs. Those who found floating debris clung to it. Those who didn't tried to swim and burned themselves out quickly in the cold. A German tanker, Phoebus, plowed through the storm with her bow shouldering green water. Captain Karl Daldorf saw lights fall from the sky and veer toward the ocean. He altered course and ordered searchlights swung down the waves. At 12:55 a.m. on April 4th, his men hauled an unconscious officer over the rail, Lieutenant Commander Herbert V. Wiley, Akron's executive officer, blue-lipped, barely breathing, seawater pouring from his coat. A ship's boat ranged out again and found two more sailors, Chief Boatswain's Mate Richard E. Deal and aviation metalsmith Moody E. Irwin. The crew pulled them aboard using belts and boat hooks, while the tanker rolled hard enough to show rust-streaked hull above the waterline. The 3 survivors lay shivering on deck under blankets while Phoebus combed for others and found only wreckage, twisted frame pieces, torn fabric, and the occasional toolbox bobbing like driftwood. By dawn, news bulletins had crossed every wire desk. Dirigible down off Jersey, many feared lost. Destroyers and Coast Guard cutters pushed out from the capes, their decks running with rain. The destroyer Tucker took the survivors from Phoebus and headed for the Brooklyn Naval Hospital. The sea that day threw back nothing but debris and the bodies of men who had outlasted the night only to be beaten by cold and exhaustion. Among the dead was Rear Admiral Moffett, the most influential champion of American naval aviation. His flag, torn from its staff, washed ashore later with other fragments. The official count settled grimly. 73 dead, 3 living. It was the worst airship disaster in history, worse even than Hindenburg 4 years later, and it happened without a flame. The cause read like the log of a storm. Violent downdrafts, low altitude, weight forward, loss of control in severe weather, compounded by a fatal lack of flotation gear. Investigators noted that if each man had been issued a life jacket, as had been proposed but not executed, many might have survived long enough for rescue vessels to reach them. The single life raft had not been launched. The sea took the opportunity away. In the days that followed, the search for answers blurred with the search for remains. Wreckage drifted north and south with the currents. Fishermen found fabric and sent word to the Coast Guard. A salvage ship hooked a length of girder big as a pier beam, then lost it again when a squall snapped the cable. At Lakehurst, sailors who had handled the lines 2 nights earlier now stood at attention under low clouds as hearses rolled by. On the beach, families watched cutters move like gray pencils between whitecaps. Reporters trudged sand with notepads, zipped in oilskin pouches, writing what every witness said in the same flat way. The weather turned, the bow fell, and then there was only water and dark. A second blow landed that afternoon when a Navy J-3 blimp sent out to help with the search failed in the wind and went down near Barnegat Bay, killing 2 more men. It felt like the sea was not finished taking. Every discussion about the future of big, rigid airships now had 2 funerals to point to. In Washington, the questions came fast and unforgiving. Why fly in that weather? Why no life jackets? Why keep machines so large and delicate under the control of weather that could turn a calm sky into moving glass in an hour? The answers were careful and unsatisfying. The Navy had championed helium as safer than hydrogen, and it was, but safety against flame did not mean safety against a cold ocean and a hard wind. For the officers who had flown Akron since her commissioning in 1931, the ship had been a promise that looked like progress. She could range for days and scout hundreds of miles of sea in a single sweep. She had a hangar inside her belly and a trapeze that could recover fighter planes in flight, a feat that made crowds gasp when they saw it in the papers. She had patrolled coasts, searched for submarines, and helped the fleet find itself in fog with radio beacons. Now, men who had walked her keel and trusted her lift had to stand on wooden floors and explain why she was gone. Wiley tried to supply detail through a haze of cold and grief. He remembered the violent pitch, the sudden drop, the thud as the tail struck, and the rush of water that threw men against bulkheads. He remembered shouting for ballast and the way the ship seemed to hesitate before she went under, as if already hollowed out by the sea. He did not have answers about altitude or rates of descent that would satisfy a committee. He did have a sailor's accounting of small things that mattered more than they should have. Jackets that never arrived, lines that could have tethered men to wreckage, and the shape of waves you don't forget. Funerals stretched into the week. Coffins draped in flags were carried by men who had been drilling with those same hands a few days earlier. Moffett's body came ashore and traveled by rail under honor guard to Arlington. The photographs show a crowd bundled against wind, officers with hats in their hands, and wives with their faces set. The meaning of the loss was both public and private. The Navy lost a leader. Families lost men they loved. The nation lost faith in a kind of machine that had once looked like the future. Akron's sister ship, Macon, kept flying for 2 more years until she, too, went down at sea, though with far fewer casualties. The promise of rigid airships in American service was already cracked by the time the April storm peeled open the coast. After Akron, the fissure widened to a fault. The fleet would rely on carriers with steel decks and planes fueled by aviation gas, not fighters lowered from a sky barn strung with girders. The sky did not stop men from trying big ideas, but the ocean kept the final say when those ideas failed near water. Out on the New Jersey beaches, the storm that did it was just one of many that cleaned the coastline with wind and salt. The local people who heard the crash in the early hours talked about a distant crunch that could have been thunder, then a glow that might have been a ship's running lights, then nothing but the hiss of rain. In the morning, gulls followed the rack line where mesh, fabric, and paper washed ashore. Children found metal pieces the size of a palm and took them home until officers made the rounds and asked for them back. For a long time afterward, the fishermen who worked those waters gave wide berths to a patch of sea they couldn't mark on a chart but knew by feel. No bell tolled from a mast, and no hull slid beneath the waves with a name painted on its stern. But it was a maritime loss all the same. Men in uniform, a mission over water, rescue by merchantmen and naval ships, bodies recovered by cutters that treated the crash site like any wreck. The ocean had jurisdiction and kept it. The names are engraved where sailors are remembered, and the lessons live in manuals, procurement lists, and the reflex to reach for a life jacket before any line is cast off. On quiet nights, when the wind comes out of the southeast, you can stand near Barnegat Light and hear the ocean take deep, even breaths. The sky above is empty, but for those who know what happened there, it is still possible to imagine a gray shape moving through fog, aluminum bones humming, engines steady against air that hasn't turned yet. Then the storm arrives, as it always does along that coast in that season, and the rest is water, wind, and the long work of searchlights on black waves. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.